welcome to the meeting and approval of the agenda. This working here? Councilor Maderos, all in favor? Declaration of interest under municipal conflict of interest. Anybody has any? Seeing none. Consent agenda. There's nothing there. Announcement, nothing. Delegation. So there's a staff report for council office model. I guess that's by our clerk, DFA.
Good morning, committee. So through you, Mr. Chair, the purpose of this presentation is to do a check-in. The last check-in on the implementation of the new council office support model was last September. So we just want to provide committee in its function as a steering committee for this implementation, an annual review, an opportunity to discuss what's working, what needs to be improved, and part of this I'll just go over some of the updates since our last check-in. Terry, can you advance the slide, please? It's not advancing? Okay, through you, Mr. Chair, if you go to page 6.1-2 on your agenda, and we'll pull it up on the screen in a moment. This is just a recap of the recommendation from Council's decision of last January. It was for implementation of the new council office support model as of April 15th, 2019, so we're approaching a year of full implementation, and that set out a series of implementation steps and decisions to make sure that this new model could take effect on April 15th. Page 6.1-3 is the work plan that this committee has been working with through staff to make implementation a reality. If we can go to the next slide. Okay, thank you. So in terms of staffing, the council staffing support continues. I'm not aware personally of any sort of additional onboarding of staff, but as and when staff changes are required, both HR and the clerk's office as required are providing assistance to the council office. We have the council office assistant, the 6th floor reception, which is a city clerk position, which is implemented to provide support for people coming onto the office and onto the floor, and ensuring that the secure access is maintained. The council office management and ethical framework, so that is incorporated into employment terms and conditions for any of the contract staff that are hired within the office. This committee continues to function as a steering committee for implementation. Policy documents, the mayor and councilor's expense policy has been updated a few times last year as we've gone through the implementation process, and there is an item on today's agenda to further discuss or consider updates to the expense policy. The council handbook has been updated once last fall, and we're looking at doing an additional update probably by the end of Q1 or early Q2 of this year. Accommodations requests are being addressed within the existing policy and council decision framework. The financials, individual councillor cost centers are in effect. They were approved as part of the 2019 council budget and will be considered as part of the 2020 budget in the next coming weeks. And in terms of communications, council has implemented a 2 newsletter model for every ward pairing of councillors and 2 annually for the mayor, and that remains in effect, and all technology supports are in place. You may recall last September, I believe it was, there was a KPMG audit of the council office budget and staffing model implementation, and there were 4 types of recommendations that were presented. The first was ensuring there's a central point of contact for councillors and their staff for any onboarding, training, and communication. That does continue both within the clerk's office and within human resources. There are formal and informal training opportunities. Some of your staff may recall we did coffee and chambers with council office staff last August. We plan to resurrect that for March, for Fridays of March of this year, for informal training and to focus on some particular training subjects for the council office, be it the members and or your staff. There was the training session with the Integrity Commissioner last September, and we are working as part of our 2020 program to identify training opportunities with the Integrity Commissioner for this year. In terms of reporting on councillor expenses, the audit called for a consolidated approach to expense claims and automation of the expense submission approval process. So work is underway through finance to develop the guideline, and training will be implemented, and I think that's slated for, I believe it's April of this year, after year-end financials and the budgets have been approved. In terms of capturing and councillor expenses and the approval of an automatic system, that procedure is in development for appropriate cost center allocation, and refresher training will also be planned for the council office in April, I believe it is, after year end and the budget is approved. And finally, an annual councillor declaration for ensuring understanding compliance with employment standards and policy. We had the first workshop with the Integrity Commissioner last year. We are planning probably more than one this year. And we'll also have some formal training opportunities on employment standards and your role as a people manager for your staff. And Mr. Chair, that's just an overview again of where we're at, and it's been 5 months since our last check-in on this, so we'd be happy to answer any questions you may have about the council support model.
Just before I go to my speakers list, I got two of them. On the GPS, not everyone's done it. As an assistant or staff, everyone's required to do it. Am I correct?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I believe as a condition, and I'm not privy to the employment contracts for all the council office staff, but I believe as contract non-union staff, there may be a performance management component in that. I'll verify that with HR, and then that will need to be addressed, because I think that program closed within the last few weeks for 2019. So we want to ensure that all 2019 assessments have been completed.
Okay, and because I've done mine, so we spent over 2 days doing it. So, or everyone does it, or just we'll take it right out. Since it's a new model and they work for us, just our staffing, they're still required to do it. That's all I'm asking.
That's my understanding.
So everyone has to do it then?
That is my understanding. I'm not privy to the employment contracts for all the councillor office staff, but my understanding in their role is they would be subject to that.
Okay, so everyone should do it. Okay. Councilor Medeiros. Oh, sorry, Councilor Dillon, right here, right here.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a quick question to you, Mr. Fay. In terms of the council training opportunities, can you just briefly talk about what opportunities are available?
Through you, Mr. Chair. Well, the councillor office staff are eligible to participate in corporate training, so the corporate training curriculum, which is available online. And I'm not sure if some of your staff have taken advantage of that. So there is a full curriculum that HR and the various departments have put together on a whole series of training opportunities, from HR matters to just general how to respectful workplace, occupational health and safety, how to be a good team player. There's a whole suite of training opportunities that staff would be available to participate in. In terms of the informal training, what we've done and the model we used in 5 Fridays in August last year is we came into this chambers for a 2-hour session, and we had some topics in mind that we went over, and how the procedure bylaw works, how motions become a decision. We talked about HR, we talked about freedom of information, access to information, protection of privacy. We talked about trees, and we talked about driveways. And those Fridays were set aside for 2 hours for any council office staff to come forward, ask any questions, and we would have staff here to respond to those.
So in terms of like the curriculum you were speaking about, is it for personal development? Can they take a course and just hypothetically like a Word or Excel or something? Are those type of courses available? Are there municipal courses available?
Through you, Mr. Chair, those courses are available, but for those type of specific examples, I think it's more online, sort of self-serve training, just because of the, so we don't have Word courses where you're in a classroom necessarily, but there's a lot of online training opportunities that are available for staff.
They're from the city or?
Through the city, yes.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Medeiros.
Thank you, through the chair. I guess the staff regarding our accommodation. So we had made a decision early in terms of, I think there was that one opportunity for us to decide if we wanted to make accommodations or not. I guess, I was one of those who decided to go as is because I didn't know I was going to get a second staff person. I ended up getting a second staff person. But then after, one of the challenges that I've noticed recently is the configuration of our space. So we don't have the same sort of nice alignment that I guess the nice offices have, where they can have two people there beside each other. They have the space and everything. We're sort of crunched in this little square. And, one of the counselors had someone working on a table outside, and then after we have, so, at the time, and because our, I wouldn't say it's equitable, but we don't have the same luxury that the other counselors on the other side have. If we wanted to relook at those accommodations, I understand our decision would come out of our own budget to make those accommodations.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks for the question. So the current policy on Appendix B states that non-standard office furniture for members of council will be charged to a capital account funded from and reported as part of a member of council's business expense. It does allow already for up to two staff, and accommodation for 2 staff per counselor. And so if there's one now and it's an addition of a second one, that's included in the policy. If there's other adjustments from an accommodation perspective outside of that, then it's funded by and reported on separately. My sense is, from a facilities management perspective, that it's one city hall. It's the same building. There's office moves and accommodations on a regular basis. And so for me, it makes sense that just be absorbed already from a staffing perspective into our already budget that's there. To do that, though, would require an adjustment in the policy, particular Appendix B. And so you can simply make the amendment, recommend the amendment today, and it would go to council for approval, or staff can revise a draft for you for the next meeting.
Okay, and I guess through the chair, would this give the opportunity for all the councillors to make that one last decision? But I think some already equipped themselves with the 2 spaces, so that wouldn't impact them, but it would allow others if they wanted to, specifically around, I guess, the square area, because I know another councillor, he might want to use that as an option as well, just because I saw there's a desk in the middle of the hallway or in terms of the space. Okay, so you would just need some form of amendment moved? I don't mind moving the amendment, or what?
Through the chair, the policy already provides for 2,
Oh, okay, so we don't do it in anything.
unless you were proposing to increase that.
No. So what, we just, I guess, sent an email request to Al's team, and they can start on that then. Okay, so everything's in place then. Great.
Yeah, I think the exception would be if there's any changes beyond the 2.
Yeah,
And part of the challenge
and that's
then,
understandable.
yeah, is if there's a move that impacts another counselor or another counselor's office space, and then it's kind of that domino effect of budgeting and attributing to various folks.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so a certain counselor may not want that reported because the move is being requested from another counselor. And so to just remove the dynamic, at the end of the day, it's the city space. So there, if it's not required today to accommodate in this particular case, there may be consideration down the road as well.
Okay, so there's nothing I have to do right now then? Yeah, okay, thank you.
Thank you. So, just a couple of questions. So, there's really one counselor that's really stuck in the middle there. Because I have space, and Councilor Bowman has space. It's really the only one that has, is Councilor Madero's. So maybe we can look at his. Because if he wants to add the other staffing, he's got no room there. So we're gonna come back to council, or just bring a report back?
No, I just
Yes.
request,
Request?
there's nothing.
Okay. So, I don't need no motion here, no. Just recommendation, right?
I just,
Yeah. So
There's
move
no
the
more
report.
questions,
No
move
more
the
question, more report. Councilor Maderos, all in favor? Okay. So we'll go over to 7.1, report for revision, council expense policy consultant service. Councilor Williams?
Do you have staff review the report or no?
Sorry?
Is staff going to provide a report or review it or no?
We have a report.
Well, I was, at first, thank you through the chair. I just want to thank the staff for the time they took to create this report. You know, as per the recommendations, Council Fortini's motion, you know, at the time I didn't support it, but I do now, and I think I would just move that we adopt the recommendations in the report and move on.
Before we move on, can we go through the report there? On the 7.1-2. So still states that we can get a consultant, so.
Sorry, Councilor, do you mind, through the chair, repeating that question, actually? So 7.1-2,
Right. It states that we're still allowed to have a consultant. But I thought the Toronto model, you have to be in business for so many years. I think we put in there 3 years and has to come through council.
So
And the
through-
only time it cannot be approved if staff cannot support.
through the chair,
Yes.
the City of Toronto policy specifically says that consulting services are eligible expense.
Right.
And staff did reach out to City of Toronto staff to confirm if there's any other requirements in terms of that 5-year rule or that 5-year guideline for business, and the City of Toronto staff confirmed that there's no such requirement. So the main thing that they have in their policy is what's stated there, and that's what staff have kind of used to draft around in terms of verbiage to add to the existing Brampton policy.
So we're not allowing any consultant.
No, the recommendation through the chair is right now, we would adopt that verbiage, and consulting expenses would be eligible as long as they meet the criteria laid out on 7.1.3 or 7.1-3.
So before we did this model, we have an E8 and AA. The whole idea was that EA is your consultant. So we're gonna have 2 staff, then we're gonna have a third one, so long as we're in that budget of what we have, the $200,000 budget. So I don't, you know, we gotta look at the taxpayers. If we already did this model once with EAA, I like to stick like that with no consultants, because sooner or later, it's gonna be overboard, and we're gonna carry on and carry on and carry on. Even our budget, I think, is too much, but we allowed it, and now we're kind of over abusing it. That's how I see it. So I'm not gonna accept the consultant fees for no one. I think hiring 2 assistants if we want, I have 1, as an EA and AA was already, I think, way a step forward from last term. Councilor Vicente.
Mr. Chair, considering that I believe Councilor Williams has put a motion to accept the recommendations, I unfortunately can't agree with that. I don't believe that we should be able to hire a consultant that can possibly skirt rules of code of conduct, et cetera. We've had this conversation many times before. So I believe that if you're hiring somebody on an ongoing basis to work on behalf of your office, to advance your agenda, to service the residents of your wards, that should be an individual that is hired through the process that we have currently, which is through as a member of your staff. And given that there is some, it's not clear whether someone who is a staff member who is definitely subject to the code of conduct, as opposed to a consultant who should be, but it's not clear whether they are in fact or are not. I would move that we not accept this recommendation. I understand that Toronto does it, but we've had some issues here in Brampton that have caused some differences of opinion here in the council. And I think moving forward, if we're going to operate better, we should operate all on the same level and do so transparently through the expense limit that we have, which I believe is set at $200,000. If you need to hire somebody to work for you to do the job that you were elected to do, you do so within that framework and not be able to go outside of that. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Santos.
Thank you. Through you, Chair, I appreciate the recommendations and some of the expense policies that are suggested via the City of Toronto, but we do, as Councilor Vicente said, have some differing ways that consultants are used here at the City of Brampton. I am quite concerned about the behavior of a consultant versus staff, and very specifically, the code of conduct, confidentiality, access to the sixth floor, in-camera material. A consultant who is not privy to the same obligations as a hired staff person has a lot more loopholes to play with in terms of what they may or may not be doing. And I'm not sure whether or not it's clear here, whether or not invoicing and being very explicit on deliverables is going to suffice in terms of meeting the code of conduct standards that a staff person is expected to uphold. The other thing is, quick question, when you're a staff person, so we just talked about training, for example, GPS training and how to go to various departments and how to appropriately deal with various bylaws, et cetera. Would that training be also provided to consultants? Would they be required as a consultant to take that training to understand the system and the bylaws, et cetera, that the city has to work within?
Through the chair, I mean, I suppose that's up to the specific counselor to recommend that or work with the rest of the city to, you know, schedule a meeting or some sort of training for that consultant to take part in. I don't see why, you know, they could also share all of our bylaws, all of our policies as well with that
Right.
individual or corporation.
Right. So it's still unclear why then, as counselors, we wouldn't just hire staff or contract staff to therefore cover code of conduct issues, behavioral issues. And the other thing that I worry about is time of work. So if there's a consultant that is hired, what is their work, what is like their standard work time, working hours? Does it count when they are on social media posting things in the middle of the night? Does that count as work? So there's still a lot of gray, blurry sort of loopholes that could be taken advantage of. And based on that, and based on my ongoing concerns regarding consultants versus hiring staff, which was the spirit of this model to begin with, I'm not supporting the recommendations, and I do support what Councilor Vicente has shared. Thank you.
Thank you. So there's a motion, I guess, on the floor,
Through
to
you,
not
Mr.
accept?
Through you, Mr. Chair, so Councilor Williams was on the board first, and she moved what appeared to be to approve the staff recommendations. So that motion should be considered first, because the motion to not adopt staff recommendations is contrary and shouldn't be introduced unless the first one fails.
I'll finish my speakers first. Is that okay? Councilor Medeiros?
Thank you. To the city clerk, I guess, just clarification. So there was no formal amendment by Councilor Vicente or Councilor Santos, just that they wouldn't approve staff report. Is that correct?
Through you, Mr. Chair, yes. So I take Councilor Williams' motion as to adopt the amendments to the expense policy to use of consultants. The effect of Councilor Vicente or Councilor Santos is a contrary. So it shouldn't be accepted until the first motion is.
Okay, so essentially, we're voting right now to accept the report as is.
Yes, to approve the
Okay.
revised
And if we don't
expense
agree
policy.
with certain aspects of it, then we'd have to vote it down.
And
And
then
then
it-
if there's an amendment.
That's correct.
Okay, but in the case, through the chair, in the case of just saying that no more consultants are required, that would just be simply just voting against staff report and that's it? And that leaves as is, or we would actually need an amendment to say remove consultants?
Through you, Mr. Chair, if the intent of the committee is to go down that path,
Yeah.
then I would recommend that there be a motion introduced, presuming the first one does not
Okay.
carry, to be that explicit, such that
And
the
that's what
expense
Councilor
policy would have to be
Vicente is
appropriately amended to be explicitly clear in the future.
Okay. And through the chair, I guess the staff. So we talked about the Toronto model. So is there not any approval required by, I guess, council for consultant expenses? Or it's just really the individual, I guess, discretion of the councillor?
Through the chair, so from our questions and the way that they've outlined in the policy, there's no specific approval needed from council. but there is a reporting mechanism in there. I think they say that it'll be reported quarterly to council, but there's no approval. It's just a reporting mechanism.
And through the chair, did you see the type of consulting services that Toronto councillors would require? Because when we look at your first paragraph, or what staff have provided, so when it talks about giving advice, information, recommendations, that is unavailable from city staff. So the only thing that'd be unavailable from city staff would be political advice. Everything else we would get. So for example, communication, so on and so on. So essentially what advice staff would not give us would be political in nature. Is that correct?
I think through the chair, from the discussion we had with them, it was more around, it also might be a resourcing issue as well. If staff are unavailable to respond to something specifically, so you might go out and get it, but we didn't get into very specifics of what do they actually do, but the discussion was around things that the staff may not be able to comment on or may not have the availability or resource availability to get back to council on.
So through the chair, it's interesting you point on resourcing. So when we first started this term of council, we had assigned to us only one assistant per councillor. Is that correct? City clerk? Okay. So effectively allowing each councillor to hire two, we increased it by 100%, our capacity. So if you think about what we did, we actually took a huge leap to help sourcing, to help with resourcing, because we recognize each councillor works differently. And if we followed the model previously for the last, I don't know, 10, 20 years, each of us right now today would be having one councillor and we would not be able to talk about resourcing. There are other councillors who effectively don't just use one or two or choose to use part-time regimes or any of that to identify resourcing and meet the needs of, you know, the way that they want to run their office. So they might want to have one staff person and maybe have two part-timers, one from a certain community group or one focusing on communications. So essentially what we've done, and you hit the nail on the head, was resourcing. This council is very progressive in adding two assistants. So to have a consultant, to suggest that councillors here would need to increase their resourcing by 300% or 200%, I think now is a little bit of a stretch in my per se. But I think effectively, if resourcing is the source of wanting to go to a consultant, we have to recognize we already took a big leap by going to two. And certainly, who knows, maybe in future councils, there may be that desire to have further resourcing and allowing a larger budget or larger consultant. But what I find is we already did this major step in Brampton. We can't, I think, keep continuing to go into areas without, you know, seeing after this 4 years how this went, because it was a major leap. We got backlash. So I think it would be prudent for us to maintain the two. I guess just lastly, the staff. So you looked at the Toronto, other neighboring counties, other neighboring municipalities. Would you say, in general, there is, you know, looking at the top tier, if you're looking at the top tier municipalities, would you say it's standard that councillors get access to consultants, or it's very particular to the City of Toronto? Or can you make any comment of that nature?
So from a policy perspective, when we reviewed, and we did reach out to Mrs. Saga and Peel as well, they were saying basically that there's nothing in the policy that specifically prohibits it, but from a practice perspective, they haven't seen it. I think that's the consensus that we got back from some of the other ones. So there's nothing specific in the policy, but at the same time, from a practice perspective, they haven't seen that being used.
Yeah, so through the chair, I guess just saying that consultants, you know, and one thing with the Toronto has its own municipal act. They have its own population, which is pretty much the largest city in Canada, so they're very unique. So I appreciate that they do have that maybe resourcing issue that we don't have. But I think, you know, to be consistent and to really stop the lines of being blurred, I would support what Councilor Vicente is going to put forward. But I appreciate the work going through this, and it's a learning curve for all of us. And but I do say some of the backlash I received from my residents in terms of going to already a political model, which we're in, was a big leap forward. And I think we should be prudent now and wait to see after the 4 years, and whoever's here in the next 4 years to review if consultants is an option that you want to look at. Thank you.
Councillor Dillon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a question to staff in regards to the use of consultants and what's acceptable and what's appropriate. I've never used a consultant. I'm not sure if I would use one, but I'm just trying to think of like a hypothetical. If someone wanted to, if there was a study done, say a traffic issues, a traffic study done, but a councillor believed that staff might be incorrect, could they hire a consultant, a traffic expert, to maybe even, I guess, show staff that, hey, you know, there is indeed a traffic issue here, whereas staff says there isn't?
Through the chair, I think that would be a good example, actually. Where there's an opinion, there could be multiple sides of the discussion, and a council member may want some more background research on an issue in order to discuss the topic in more fulsome.
Right. So even perhaps just to the council members, maybe if we're headed in that direction to remove consultants, maybe there could be some room for considerations such as this, where there's a specific, like for example, traffic, or there might be, I don't know, something park related. If we can identify specific issues where we could hire a consultant, if in case the need comes where a councillor needs advice. So I'm just throwing that out there, because I think we're headed in the direction where we're getting no consultants, but there might be a situation where you need a consultant for a specific situation. So even if we could outline those specific situations as well.
Thank you. Councillor Vicente.
Thank you. Just to, I know we have the first motion that's out there first, as per the clerk, but just to clarify more on the idea that we should not be accepting this report and what Councillor Dillon just said. There's a difference between, and we've had this conversation around this table before, if I need to obtain a professional service and I'm hiring someone or an organization to do a very particular task, it's a one-time opportunity or project. And so, for example, I could see a situation where I might hire someone to perhaps produce a video for me. And so that's a one-time thing. When you have someone who is regularly in your employ and you're paying them essentially monthly on an invoice basis, and we've had this discussion before, unfortunately what you're doing is you're splitting up what is essentially could be a 4-year contract into monthly installments. And as was reported in the media, we have a consultant here at the city who's already reached 21,000 or so. My memory may not be exactly correct, but approximately $20,000 or more in billings, and we're only about a year into this term. So if that were to continue to go unchecked, you're essentially in contravention of our purchasing rules. Would that be correct, through you, Chair, to staff?
Through the chair. So, I mean, what's in front of you here would require all of the procurement policies to be followed. Contracts would have to be established between the councillor and the organization or individual.
Right. So if Councillor Dillon, for example, wants to retain the services of an expert to provide him, or another member of council wishes to get an expert opinion, and that has happened, I believe, even in this term, that's a one-time expense, and that's reported on your expense report. it's a fee that you incur for that particular project. When you have an individual or an organization providing you ongoing service, you reach a threshold at some point very quickly. And that still doesn't address the other problem, which I stated before, which is the external organization. It's not clear as to whether or not they are subject to the code of conduct. And really, that's the crux of this issue. Once a person, if a member of council sees themselves requiring the services of an individual for an extended period of time, that's great. Hire them as part of your staff. They are subject to all of the covenants of the code of conduct, all of those commitments to be respectful of other members of council, et cetera, and. And I think members of council will have no issue with that. So I would respectfully say that we should not accept this report, and that further, Mr. Clerk, that we restrict throughout the remaining term of this council that consultants are not to be hired by council offices. If other members of council wish to make further amendments, that's what we're here for. Thank you.
Okay, so I guess we'll vote on a recorded vote on the consultant fees on this report.
So this is to
To-
accept the staff report as is.
As is. Councilor Dillon.
Sorry, just to clarify, what Councilor Vicente is referring to, those one-time, one-offs, like, for example, the traffic, will still be able to get those, is that correct? Well, like, if, for example, like, even like, he was mentioning a photographer, a photo shoot or something, those are not considered consultants for a traffic study then?
Through the chair, so if this report and the recommendation is voted down and a new motion is put forward to accept no consulting, then those one-time things like hiring a consultant for a traffic report, you would not be allowed to do that. Now, if you want to hire a photographer or, somebody that's more a contracted service, what we're saying is by the definition, what we were talking about in terms of what a consultant is, by definition, those things would still be allowed. So if you hired a photographer, if you hired some sort of, like a service provider to do a newsletter or, those types of things, those would be allowed. But
Right.
to hire somebody for professional guidance
Yeah.
and advice, that would not be allowed.
So, would you be able to, just from your own perspective, identify an area, like 3 or 4 or 5, however many they would be, where you could, I guess, predict where councillors would need information? Like you said, that might be a good example, the traffic one. And so I'm just saying, if we go through with this, I see it headed in that direction. I wouldn't want to limit specific advice for a specific situation where a councillor might need that. Like, I'm not sure if anybody's done it thus far. I haven't. I don't foresee myself doing it either, but I'm just saying the opportunity should be there, I guess, for those specific situations. Is there any language we could add to that, and maybe you can identify some certain areas where you'd foresee it?
If I may, through Chair, and I'll ask legal to comment as well, because I think it's important there's a level of clarity for your decision-making. One is with respect to the traffic study example. My sense is that's not something that staff would recommend from potentially 11 different traffic studies, if you all get one, and staffs. And so if there's interest in getting a traffic study or multiple traffic studies, council would direct staff to go and get 1 or 2, as you have before with various legal opinions. And then it's a corporate response. So I just wanted to, be careful around the traffic study piece and those examples in the context of 11 budgets and 11 different studies on a particular item. And with that, I'll pass it to legal as well for comment.
Through the chair, I would obviously agree with what you've just heard from our CAO. But in addition, when I read the proposed amendments here, they specifically refer to consultants that can provide information and services that are unavailable from city staff. So something like the example of a traffic consultant, that is something that is available from city staff, or could be directed for city staff to obtain. So I don't necessarily agree that it would be covered off by this kind of a policy. Perhaps something like, and even to the extent of a video, I mean, that potentially is something that's available through our strategic communications, or newsletters would be available through our strategic communications. So I think that even to the extent that of the policy that is being recommended here in the staff report, I think it is limited to things that can't be provided by staff. And so I just wanted to provide some clarity from my perspective as to what that means.
So, sorry, it could be provided, but like going back to the video example, say we wanted to shoot a video for an event that we're holding. It could be, community skate. I know there's one coming up, and it's non-political. I know some councilors are holding it, but if they wanted to shoot a promotional video for it, would they be able to do that through the city videographer?
Through you, Chair, thanks for the question. Those currently occur. It's usually the mayor, but certainly in context of the local ward councilor as well, my sense is absolutely. If the request is made and staff are there doing the video anyway. In fact, there's a very good creative team that is more and more proactive on these things, and I think that level of engagement is very helpful.
So it's not because it's corporate staff and it's not a corporate event, they could still have, like for example, going back to the skating event, they could still use corporate staff to make that video, even though it's not a corporate event.
I think that's where we're getting into the difference. If it's a corporate event, 100% staff are there to support. If it's not a corporate event, that's another conversation.
Because I'm just trying to get, try to understand what we're allowed to do and what we're not allowed to do. So would we not be able to shoot a video or get somebody to shoot a video, or would we be able to? Because they're not, I don't know if they're technically a consultant or not.
I think that speaks to the point raised by the treasurer earlier. If it's a videographer, as an example, for a community event that's not a corporate event, I look to legal for guidance on that as well.
Sure, through the chair. If it's not available through staff, so if it's not a corporate event and it's therefore not supported through staff, then you would have to have it done through your employee. If you engaged, if you do not pass this, you would have to have it done through an employee. If you pass this, you could potentially have that done through a consultant, so long as it's not available through staff. So in that example, if it was not available through staff because it was not a city function,
right,
then if this policy was passed, then that would be the type of thing you could engage a consultant.
So, but is the person who's shooting the video considered a consultant? They're not providing advice per se. They're just forming a function.
So I think it's just a service. That
Yeah, service.
But these days, we're talking on the video. Until now, we've been doing our own videos with our phones and our staff.
No, I'm just trying to understand
example.
what we're able to do and what's considered a consultant or not, or a service. Is a service a consultant?
Well, based on the definition that is in this report, it actually would not be a consulting service, because it's very specific here, advisory capacity that is compensated to give advice, information, and recommendations. So it wouldn't be covered by this, nor would anything that would be available through staff be covered by this.
So it would not be covered?
It would not.
So you would not be able to hire somebody to shoot a video, promotional video, for an event that you're holding that's not corporate?
Not under the terms that's drafted here.
Through the chair, so if it was for somebody like a videographer and it wasn't available through staff, you would be able to do that?
We would be.
Correct. What we're saying here is somebody that provides advice, guidance, recommendations, that type of advice,
Yeah,
would not be allowed.
okay. Yeah, that answers it, thank you.
Just quickly, don't we have that already in our budget as a professional fee? It's part of in our budget,
Under the current policy, you're allowed to do that.
as a professional.
As long as you have budget, you can,
You're not a consultant, so it's a professional fee you could always get. Okay, so there was a recorded vote called by Councilor Williams in support of the staff.
Through you, Mr. Chair, yes, a recorded vote's been requested on the staff recommendations to be approved. There are 5 members of the committee, all in favor of the staff recommendations. Please stand to be counted. Showing in favor of the staff recommendation is Councillor Williams. All opposed to the staff recommendations, please stand to be counted. Showing as opposed is Councillor Vicente, Chair Fortini, Councillor Medeiros, Councillor Dillon. Mr. Chair, the motion loses 1-4.
So there was another Vicente amendment, I think, or another motion, correct?
Through you, Mr. Chair. Oh, sorry.
Councilor Vicente, sorry. Oh,
So through you, Mr. Chair, if I understand what Councillor Vicente was moving, is if you look at the attachment to the report, it included language under the proviso of a positive recommendation to include use of consultants. So I think what Councillor Vicente is recommending is a motion to explicitly say that consultants are not permitted to be used by members of council, and that then would mean that F, which is here, would be moved down as an ineligible expense in the expense policy. And I think and then this other narrative can be removed. But I think it's also important to keep the definition of a consultant, because that has been part of the conversation to confirm what a consultant is in terms of an advisory capacity role, which is now prohibited, whereas still contracted services or professional service providers for discrete services would still be a permitted expense.
a one-time expense or monthly? That's the difference.
through the chair. So typically consultants not consultants, but, even consultants or contracted service, they're typically hired for a task. So you have some sort of initiative at hand, and that's what you hire them for. So if it's a videographer or a photographer or,
I'm just worried that those services will last a whole year.
typically you don't.
That's what I worry about.
Again,
So we're using just a different name as a consultant.
well, again, what's being proposed is it's the portion related to the guidance, advice, recommendation piece that is amending here, to do those other sort of, assuming it's not available through staff, those other more, I guess, routine sorts of tasks would still be allowed. What I would recommend, though, to all counselors is that maybe before you initiate something, is you speak to myself, the deputy treasurer, to clarify whether something you're looking to do would fit under the policy or not.
Once we pass this motion through, maybe we could come back here in the next meeting and say, put some guidelines. These are what we outline, what we can use it for. Like photography, these days, we're all using our own assistants in any videos. So that was an example.
Through the chair, it's hard to be all-inclusive. I mean, we can certainly identify some things, but the world is always evolving and changing. And so, I mean, it'd be very difficult for us to put an exhaustive list together of that.
And that's why, that's why I worry. I don't want a service to last a whole year or 2 years, so I still provide the service. It's just really doing the same thing, just using a different name. Using all-weather service limited or using that's what I worry about. So if there should be a maximum maybe we could put on there as like, on fee. Councilor Vicente, a maximum we could use as a fee for the term, like a $5,000 maximum or something, because I don't want to last a whole year. Right? Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. So staff was asked to come back with the Toronto model, and that's what's in this report. Now that it's very clear, there's no interest or intent to go down that route. We hear where you want to go, And my sense is rather than trying to wordsmith it all and then maybe not getting it exactly right again, one option is just simply refer it to staff to try to get the appropriate wording accurate, to report back either to this committee or report back in time for council. That's just an option, I think, is so that we make sure we're getting it right for you.
So Toronto, we did say Toronto. They don't have their own council office like we do in other municipalities, so they hire 5 assistants and a consultant. But if you look at Mississauga, Vaughan, and all, they don't have it in their policy, but it's never been used. Never been used. So Toronto, you can't look at Toronto, 3 million people, and they have their own office in the area where they run, and they have their own staff, and it's not like us or other municipalities. We have our own. So, or we could put a limit on it, or just figure out about Councilor Vicente. I'll put him back on the board.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree with what the CAO has said. I think that is the wise approach for us to take. So perhaps what we can do is we have voted down this report as it is. And so I will withdraw my motion and reword it to say that this be referred back to staff for clarification on what is permitted and what is not, particularly around the use of, I prefer to call them external service providers. I don't know if that is a legal term, but any external service that a member of council may engage. And I think that we need to address finally how any service that we engage with must also comply with the code of conduct, just as we must comply. And that we continue to freeze the use of consulting services as we established last year, pending the outcome of staff's work in this report that we're now asking you to undertake.
And that will come at the next member or governance meeting? Okay. Okay, thank you. Councilor Williams.
And just a quick question. When, through the chair to the staff, when you hire staff as a counselor, when you hire staff through the HR process, is the number of staff that you hire public knowledge, and who you hire public knowledge?
Through you, Mr. Chair, perhaps I could start. The number would probably be public knowledge. The names per se probably are not broadcast, but in the day-to-day activities that a council office may undertake, they will become known if they're interacting with the public on behalf of the council.
And on their cards and newsletters.
Okay. And is there, thank you, through the chair, is there rate of pay public knowledge? Their salary?
Go ahead.
Sorry. The salary bands are public, but not the individuals pay within the band.
So the individual, just say the counselor decides to pay somebody less than what the band is or more than what the band is, it's not for public to know. Is that correct?
Through you, Mr. Chair, generally not, unless for some reason somebody meets the threshold to be reported publicly on what's known as the sunshine list. Having said that, there is a reporting out of a what I would call a bundled number for labor-related expenses for each of the councillors that's reported on the quarterly reports.
Okay. So the bundle number, not each individual person that is hired to your office.
That's correct. I don't believe it's by individual.
Okay, thank you.
Just a quick question. I thought in November, we were saying that we're not gonna put the name, but we're gonna put payroll 1, payroll 2, payroll 3, like Mississauga and other cities, and it shows how many people have working, not one number completely. That's how an expense should be, because I couldn't make ends meet on that one we have. It shows if I give a check to Big Brother, Big Sister, $250, but it doesn't show payroll. So how can transparency?
So through the chair, so if you don't bundle it and you unbundle the number,
We have to,
then that would highlight individual salaries, which may be, a challenge for in terms of reporting. You know, it's possible to update the description in the report to say this is two AAs or an EA and an AA, or, you know, you could identify that in the description, but still have a bundled number so that it, you know, it's not reported out what an individual employee actually makes.
I didn't, last time I thought we made it clear, we understand we cannot put the assistant's name for privacy. But I thought you have payroll 1, payroll 2, it's divided. Why, when I give a check to big brother, big sister, breast cancer, you put the whole description down where it goes, so people know. And that part, we have one lump sum. So how do they know I could give my assistant 200,000 or I could give her 150,000? It has to show how many, you know, the difference, more transparent.
Through the chair, it is more transparent, but there is the privacy issue in terms of an individual employee's salary, aside from what the clerk mentioned regarding the public sector salary disclosure of 100,000 or more. It's just a challenge. If you break those line details out, then you know, anybody looking at that report would be able to identify, especially if you know somebody's an executive assistant versus an aide, or, you know, or an admin assistant. It would be clearly identify what an individual's salary would be.
Okay. I'm fine with that. You know, we already have our business cards, shows the names on the newsletter, tells the people. It already tells how many people are working for us, so it makes no difference really if it's one sum or break it up. Okay, so we'll send this back to staff. Is that what you wanted to do, Paul? Councilor Vicente? So all in favor to go? Sorry, Councilor Dillon? I gotta go.
A question, actually. I think it might be unrelated. Perhaps you can just let me know, Mr. Clerk, the actual titles for the for each staffer. Are we able to change those if need be, or are they specific to the band that that the staff person makes?
Through you, Mr. Chair, when the new council office support model was established, there were essentially a menu of 3 types of positions available for councillors: an executive assistant, a councillor assistant, and I believe the third was called an administrative assistant, with some suggested pay grades. And the members of council were to use that within their discretion and within their approved budgets to do their own hiring. It probably would make sense to retain those 3. I think there was enough flexibility built into that menu of positions to allow each of the councillors to staff their offices accordingly to undertake whatever support is required for their duties.
Right, so, but if we, I guess the way, for example, my staff has evolved, one staffer might not be doing it exactly the one role of an AA, they might be doing something else. It's up to us to, are we able to change their position title? Or, like I said, is that position title just tied to the pay band?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I would recommend you stay consistent with position titles just for consistency, but there is discretion for members of council to assign different duties and or change you know, a position that may be an administrative assistant to a councillor assistant, as the case may be, to meet your needs.
Thank you.
Okay. So all in favor to send it back to staff? Carried. So 8.1, I asked this, I think the clerk already talked about it. This is, sorry?
Sorry, through the chair, the motion that I think Councillor Vicente put forward is to refer back to staff as well as continue the freeze placed on
Yes.
consulting services. So I
Yes.
just wanted to clarify through the clerk whether or not that has also been voted upon.
Through you, Mr. Chair, the referral is 3 parts. The first part is for staff to report back on explicitly prohibiting the use of consultants in the policy. The second is to have staff report back on permitted external service provider type services that would be provided under the policy. And the third is to continue with Council Resolution C-422, 2019, to ensure that freeze remains until council makes a final decision.
And it's coming back the next meeting we have, and I think
In May.
maybe we could put a cap on it, so I don't know, it's up to you. So, you know, feel, okay. Right? Okay, so carry on. 8.1, I asked for this, so at the region, we went through our code of conducts, and I think ours, we're setting up another meeting, Peter, because a lot of them have been changed, and I think we should line up ours, like Mississauga and Caledon did with the region appeal. I think ours are a little bit, done 5 years ago. I think.
Through you, Mr. Chair, so council's current code of conduct was approved in February 2016. There's been one amendment, just a housekeeping amendment in 2018. The Region Appeals Code of Conduct, I understand, was approved in 2017. The City of Mississauga has just approved a new Code of Conduct as of January 2020. I looked at those codes on the weekend, and they generally still align. But I can tell you that as part of the work program for our Integrity Commissioner, revisiting and potential revisions, presumably through guidance from this committee, is on the work plan to make sure that there is some alignment.
Yeah, and we did some changes in Mississauga, mostly on the expenses, because we get golf tournaments that say it's low. So really, you get a foursome, you're going out to do a charity event, and we can't go because we're over the threshold, because everything's gone up. And I think even though we went through it, but there's still the code of conducts from last term, 2014. We just made 1 or 2 amendments, but everything else stays the same. Am I correct?
That is correct, and the province has passed a regulation in terms of what must be in a code of conduct.
Right.
Our code of the City Council's code of conduct does reflect the requirements, and in my quick view of the new Mississauga code, it still is very much aligned. The language is a little different, but the rules per se
Okay.
are aligned.
So I'll leave it up to you. We can set up a meeting, or maybe just, I don't know if we need the Integrity Commissioner, or we just do ourselves as a workshop. So, there's not much there. I think there's 2 or 3 items. Should be there? Okay, I'll leave it up to you. Okay, thank you. So, correspondence, Councilor's question period. Any questions? I have a couple. I want to go back to the newsletter. I forgot. The newsletter. So the region sends out a newsletter, and they give us a couple of dates, and they coordinate with the other 2 or 3 municipalities. Is there any way we could do a newsletter, or it's done in April, or we print them, and then it's up to the ward councilor when they want to send it out? Because if we get 2 newsletters in 1 week at the same house, it doesn't look good for us, saying we're wasting taxpayers' money, or, you know, you get 1 from the region, 1 from the city. So maybe we spread them out a bit. You know, we can work with that. Or if we could send it out in April, because I think the dates, the region, I think, worked with Mississauga and Caledon, and they give us 3 dates, so if maybe, let's see if we can line it up maybe a month later, and not get 2 all at once in the same week. Doesn't look good.
Thank you, Chair. So you're speaking of the corporate newsletters or corporate material going out versus the councilor newsletters?
That's right, the council's newsletters.
Okay. Oh, councilors' newsletters? I think that may be councilor's discretion.
Yeah. Well, we have a date, I think. And
3
we
years.
all go at once. So the region, they do the printing, and they give us 3 dates when we want to mail them out.
Okay.
So maybe we could do the same here, and try to do a month later after them, and it's up to the ward councilor to mail it out, because it's either one all at once, or we could do in April, at least break it up.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I believe there was a communication last week from the Director of Strategic Communication, setting out the timelines for the spring newsletter, and was identifying, I believe, the availability after May 1st for the mail-out of them, but, and then subsequently updating members of council that there's discretion
Yeah.
available to the 2 ward councilors in terms of when that can be released. So I don't know about accelerating the availability for release in April, but presumably that's something that we can discuss with the director.
So I remember last, okay. And my other question is to you, clerk. So we're going to come back, you're going to let us know, everyone has to do the GPS? Or none of us? I don't know. I didn't understand.
So it's referred to as the Talent Learning and Management System, TLMS, and there's a performance management system within that. The former program was called My GPS.
Yeah.
And my understanding, but I don't know for sure, so I will find out, is long-term contracts, employment contracts in place for the council office staff included a provision for some type of performance management enrollment in the program and eligibility if there's a positive performance. But I'm not privy to those contracts, so I'll have to work with HR on that to see what's possible, and then whether or not, if they haven't been completed for 2019, can they still be completed for 2019?
Well, if they can't be, if they're not completed, or everyone does it, it's a mandatory, or we don't do it at all? It's not that some do and some don't, that's all. Okay. Anyone else? Seeing none? No one from the public, I guess. Okay. Okay, I have a motion to adjourn, and the next one is May 4th, 9:30. Councilor Vicente, all in favor?